Hello, friends, and welcome to Listening to the Verde, where you will learn about what will engage, inspire, and inform you about everything that makes the Verde River healthy: water, flows, habitat, and community. My name's Max Wilson. I'm a program manager at Friends of the Verde River, and I'm joined here today by Kim Schonek. She's the Verde River Program Director at the Nature Conservancy. Thanks for joining us today, Kim.
Hi, Max. Glad to be here.
Great. Well, I was wondering, just to start off for our audience, can you tell them a little bit about who the Nature Conservancy is?
Yeah, so the Nature Conservancy is a global nonprofit. We're working in, I think, 70 countries now, and we have chapters in all 50 states. So we're a really big organization, which is why we like to partner with local organizations like Friends of the Verde River. So it's important to us to be doing on-the-ground conservation, but being able to connect it through our other work. So here in the Verde, we focus a lot on flow and partnerships, and really how do we protect and restore the Verde in the future.
So TNC is this big global organization working all around the world. Why the Verde? Like, why pick out this little river here just in, central Arizona, rural Arizona?
Yeah, so in Arizona, there's not a lot of rivers that flow like it does here in the Verde. So we have this wonderful desert river that brings all this biodiversity to our community. And so the Conservancy's actually worked on the Verde for more than 30 years. We started with a relationship with state parks. Actually, down the street at Dead Horse Ranch State Park, we worked on those acquisitions. And really, how did we build a greenway concept to allow access to the river and make sure those lands were protected? And then we've expanded on that over the last 30 plus years to how do we protect flows in the river and those sorts of things. And the river is critically important here in our community. It makes our community vibrant and beautiful. It's part of our agricultural economy. It's part of our drinking water supplies, but it's also a drinking water supply for more than 5 million people in the Phoenix metro area. So 10 cities around the Phoenix metro area depend on water from the Verde. So it's important for the biodiversity that it brings to our state. It's also very critical to the economy of our state.
I want to come back to those issues here in a second, both the agricultural as well as these downstream water users. But maybe we could start with something a little bit more personal. I think it maybe make people realize that all these connections we have with the river are to each of us as an individual. So can you just tell us a little bit, what's your first memory of the Verde?
Gosh. So I've been here working for the Nature Conservancy for about 11 years. And actually, I came to Arizona for my interview with the Nature Conservancy. And I went to my interview and it seemed pretty good and I was kind of interested. And then I thought, well, I should probably go find this river. And I moved from Oregon. And some of our rivers look very different in Oregon. Others actually are much drier. I worked a lot in eastern Oregon where we get about 11 inches of rain. So very dry, high desert sort of situations. And so I wanted to see, like, what does this river look like? And I drove around and I actually could not find the river, which to me was endlessly frustrating that there was this river. I could see it on a map, but where did you actually cross it? So when I did finally stumble upon what I was pretty sure was the river, it's just a beautiful and unique location, to be able to have these trees and to be able to change the landscape from, dusty brown and dark greens into lush and vibrant riparian area. And I came, it was in, I think it was early September or late August. And, we had just had monsoons and I was just enamored with this idea of big, fluffy white clouds and blue skies and rain and red river and, that kind of muddy flowing water after it rains in Sedona. So just really excited to be able to see the river and be able to see that flow and see how it connected with the agriculture and the landscape. And not just, it wasn't confined to just its banks, as we know. You think about the river and it spreads out throughout the Verde Valley through our ditch system. So thinking all the way back to that day, how has the river changed since then? I mean, you can find it now. That's good. What other changes have you seen since that time? I think a lot of the changes on the river in the last decade have been really positive, with increasing recreational opportunities, identifying. So that place where I went was a weed-covered park. Mm-hmm. That is now a beautiful park and has wonderful signage and easy access, and you definitely know you're at the river. And you know a lot of things about the river by reading those signs. So I think that's one piece, is the community awareness has increased. People know where the river is, they know how to access it, they know what they can do there. But we've also changed in our management, so it's much more part of the conversation, particularly with the agriculture community, investing in infrastructure and thinking about how do we manage water from where we divert it out of the river to how we get it on the fields, and how do we apply it on these fields, and using new technology to have those conversations, talking about stormwater and managing stormwater, talking about effluent and how do we use effluent, and trying to find the best uses and collaboration around these issues. So instead of doing a few things here and there, working collectively with the Nature Conservancy, Friends of the Verde River, Environmental Defense Fund, and saying, here's a suite of conservation strategies and here's a suite of stakeholders, I think has been really exciting.
And you've mentioned ag a couple of times, and for somebody who hasn't grown up necessarily in an agricultural community, can you describe for our audience just like how does the water get from the river to the agricultural field?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think even people that have lived here forever may not know. And so essentially our technology is pretty old.
Okay.
In the 1860s, settlers came and they needed to grow food to serve to the miners who were hanging out in Jerome and Prescott and all those places. And so this was really a place where you could grow food. And they needed to get water out. So the way they got water out was to build berms in the river and push it into ditches. And then they were digging these ditches with, shovels by hand, or they're called slip scoops, which are pulled by a horse. And it's basically a single plow. Okay. And it creates this channel that water can run down. And then once it's in that, it's distributed to the different users. In 1870s, there might have been 3 or 4 or 7 users on a ditch. Now some of our ditches have 1,000 users. So the dynamic of the ditch has changed significantly over time. And it's not all commercial production ag. There's a lot of landscape watering around homes. There's pastures for horses and sheep, and farmers market produce, and those sorts of things do come from our surface water irrigated lands. So, it's not a lot of difference. It's push the water out of the river, run it down the ditch. Some of the things that we've implemented in the last decade to make that better are automated head gates. So being able to measure how much water we're taking and taking the amount we need. Mm-hmm. If you need 12 CFS, you need 12 CFS, take 12 CFS. But if you don't have any way to control your diversion, you're going to take whatever is coming down it. So managing that, piping projects. So there's a lot of loss associated with dirt line ditches. And so how do we pipe those and protect those flows in the ditch and leave what we don't need in the river? Other projects just check structures and just better water management through the ditch. And then on farm, implementing things like sprinkler irrigation, drip irrigation, even just better timing and soil moisture management to reduce the demand on farm.
So obviously the community relies a lot on having these agricultural lands available. Why does it matter to the Nature Conservancy that these lands remain in production?
Yeah, I think for a lot of reasons. Our big ag lands are whole sections of land. So when we look at a farm, we're farming the lands that make sense to farm. They're the flat lands with good soils. And then the margins are left in the wild space. So, those areas on these farms are really important for wildlife to be able to move through. A lot of nesting habitat, hiding habitat, foraging and browsing habitat for deer and javelina. So it's a really important buffer to have to create passage across the river and up and down the river through these. So we've targeted protecting farms in areas where they're part of a migration corridor or part of an important area for birds and for other mammals that depend on them. So it's important to keep that ag in the landscape. It's also, I think, a question about where do we want our food to come from. And I think when we get into these issues of agriculture, it's easy to say, we should save water, let's turn off the water to the big ag. And yeah, that would put more water in the river, but it just moves that food production and that fiber production and forage production somewhere else. That demand didn't go away because that farm did. And so how do we actually produce the food that we want to eat in our community and be sustainable in that way as well? So I think that's what's important, is looking for local solutions without excluding an industry or pushing it out into another place.
And have you found, farmers to be open to those solutions?
I think we have a lot of great relationships. We've worked with quite a few ditch companies throughout the Verde Valley. We've worked with quite a few farmers. I think most folks have probably heard of Hauser and Hauser Farms. We've worked a lot with them. We've also worked with Tres Hermanas and Tres Brisas. We've worked with Sunnyside Farms. We've worked with a lot of smaller users to better manage water on their properties, and I think that has long-term benefits for both their properties as well as the community.
So the river's obviously doing a lot to support these folks in their livelihoods. I know as somebody who grew up down in the Phoenix area, the river meant a lot to me to have an area that I could come up and recreate in as well. But why does the river matter to you?
Yeah, I think the river is so critical on a personal level about what it is to be outside. Mm-hmm. I love the desert. I love to see the cactuses. That's wonderful. I love to hike in the grasslands. But for me personally, just to be able to go to the river and see water and see birds and see people out in kayaks, that's just really rewarding and enjoyable and calming and just kind of brings it back. But also to be able to go to the farms and see food production. So I love being able to kind of walk through the pecan trees and look at some pecans and, pick up a few nuts to eat and then walk down to the river and see the river flowing and know that connection exists in our community. So I think that's where it's really a great place to be here in the Verde Valley and throughout the watershed. Sometimes we forget that the watershed extends all the way up nearly to Prescott, and I actually live in Chino Valley. So I live about 10 minutes from the headwaters of the river, which is a magical place. It's kind of this little canyon and it's dry, and then you walk along and then there's like a little purple of water.
It's a river. Oh my gosh.
There's some more water and this big pool comes and a peregrine falcon. And so, it's very rewarding to see that life kind of breathed into the landscape by that little bit of water.
Well, I think we're going to have to go to a break now, but I hope that you'll stick around with us. We can talk a little bit about the threats that the river is facing and what you guys at the Nature Conservancy are doing to deal with those. So please join us back here in 30 seconds.
Thanks, Max.
Welcome back to Listening to the Verde. I'm here today with Kim Schonek of the Nature Conservancy, and we're continuing our conversation about the why flows in the Verde River matter to all of us. So, Kim, you already told us a lot about how some of this water is used. What are some of the threats that the river faces? Is our flows doing well? Are they going up? Are they going down?
Yeah, so flows in the river are determined by kind of the groundwater tables in the summertime. So we get monsoon rains, and that brings up the flow in the summer. And we also get winter rains, which brings up the flow in the winter time. But those times in between when it hasn't rained, we call that base flow. Mm-hmm. And that base flow is driven by how much water is in the groundwater table that's pushing out into the river. And so that changes over time as it gets drier and drier. So we're looking at a 20-year drought in the Colorado River Basin. So that's definitely having an impact on the river. And then it's also impacted by how much water are we extracting for other uses. And so it's really complicated to say what drives the changes in the flow. But what we see very clearly at the Clarkdale gauge, just upstream of Cottonwood here, is a sharp decline in flows over the last few years. And maybe some of the lowest flows on record are occurring this year and into the future. So we really do want to think about, as things change, how do we protect the flows that we currently have and we currently rely on, because there's no guarantee that they're going to be here forever.
Yeah, and I think your point about it being hard to know exactly, what's driving decrease in flow here versus there this year versus next year is a really good one. But just for our audience so that they understand, what are some of the big things that we know are driving these declines overall?
The big biggest thing that's driving these declines really is climate. And when we have dry winters and dry summers, and we have reduced recharge into our aquifers, we have reduced flows. Now, compounding that is the impacts of groundwater withdrawals. And those groundwater withdrawals have changed over time, and where they're located. So how close to the river you're taking water impacts it. Surface water diversions certainly have an impact on flows in the river. So there's 52 miles between the Clarkdale USGS streamflow gauge and the Camp Verde USGS streamflow gauge. So some years we see that in that 52 miles, flow might be cut in half. Wow. And that's coming from surface water diversions. And so that's an important part of our history. That's what supports our agriculture. And that's why working on projects that improve efficiency in our surface water use are so important, and important in the long term, because those are kind of the low-hanging fruit. If you can improve efficiency, 10, 12% in your surface water use, you can do that at a pretty reasonable cost compared to changing some of these other locations around groundwater pumping and things like that. So I think that's where, it's really, you got to look at all these aspects and really think about what are the things that we care about, and not so much finger pointing about who did what, and when. It's just really about, we want flows in the river, the things that are taking water, our groundwater, surface water diversions, and how do we manage those?
And what do you think, this is a kind of big question, but what do you think are the challenges that are in the way of us actually addressing those problems that you just brought up?
I don't think there's a lot of things in the way. I think the reality is we are at a place, we have a collaborative effort, we have a great community. I mean, people here in the Verde, throughout the watershed, are thinking about how do we protect this resource that's important to us. And I think those are the conversations we need to be having. There are some legal challenges, to be certain. There's questions around Clean Water Act and waters of the U.S. and adjudication and all these sorts of things that we can throw up as barriers that are really hard to deal with. But the reality is we're a community, and we can make community-based decisions and lead from within our community on identifying solutions and starting to implement the ones that we can. And where we have legal barriers, let's work on addressing those and changing those.
And I couldn't agree more with what you just said, where, I remember growing up as a kid and coming up here, and as you mentioned, you couldn't find the river. It was really hard in a lot of cases. There were a lot of no river access signs, but no river access signs. And because of that, I don't feel like the community was having those types of conversations about, is this a river we care about? And if it is a river we care about, what are we going to do to save it? How have you seen those conversations grow and change in your time here working at the Verde?
I think the biggest conversation that's changed is the importance of the river to the community itself. And this idea that having a flowing river through our community is irreplaceable. I mean, when it's gone, and the things we can do now are important to do now. And so I think that's been the biggest change, is just this recognition of the need to take action and the need to not wait. And so what can we do? And our cities and our towns are planning for it. Cottonwood is doing some amazing work around water reuse. And so putting in systems to reuse their effluent instead of taking groundwater and applying that. So there's a lot of efforts that entities are putting into this. Agriculture is making the choices to sit down and say, what can we do? How do we become part of this solution? Friends of the Verde River is doing a lot around river health and implementing watershed restoration up high in the uplands to improve sediment management projects, improving our riparian corridor with invasive plant management, engaging in things like the Verde River Exchange to drive a conversation about how are our water supplies connected. So I think there's a lot of things we're doing and we need to keep doing. And I think the part where people are engaging in outcomes is really positive.
And so if you're somebody who just lives in the community who wants to do something today to try to help save the river, what are some of the things they can do to save water and help protect the river down the road?
Yeah, I think the most important thing people can do is get educated on some facts. Go on the webpage. Friends has a great webpage. There's a land and water planning toolbox on there. Go on there and look at that. Research some of the river-friendly living concepts. Look up the river and just know what's happening here. Start to understand some of the legal context that's happening. You can do a lot in your own home to save water. Look at your outdoor landscaping. How much do you really need? We don't think that you want to cover your yard in rocks. I certainly do not. But what can you do to have native plants? What can you do to have low water use landscaping? And looking there, and then talking to your neighbors about facts and sharing facts about the river, because there's a lot of misinformation out there, and it's important to really understand what are our options and what makes the most sense. So one of the documents we have is the Verde River Watershed Report Card, and I think that has a lot of great information about our community as a whole. So spend some time reading that and really discuss it and think about what are the choices you make daily. Are there businesses you can support that are supporting these efforts, and how do you identify those businesses? Can you shop local? Can you find farmers markets and support our local agricultural economy? So I think those are the kinds of things that people can do. And then I think taking that education and talking to your elected officials. So who are your city elected officials or your county elected officials, and saying the river is important to me as a resource, and knowing some facts about what are the good choices, and helping weigh in on planning and zoning where it makes sense for you. I know not everybody wants to go to more meetings. I don't. And so, what makes the most sense in terms of where can you engage and how can you support those efforts, but making decisions from a place of fact, and understanding that, and really helping support your elected officials who sometimes have to take a risk and step out of there and say, hey, okay, I know this might not be the most popular decision, but this is what's going to help sustain us over time.
So just talking about those facts, I think it's a good place to start from. If I live in one of the Verde Valley communities and I turn on my tap, where is that water coming from, and is it having an impact on the river, my water use?
Yeah, how much of an impact is something we're not able to say. I mean, we don't, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of hard science, what's the scale, where's the pump, who's the user, right? But where your water's coming from is an aquifer that is in some way connected to the Verde River. It's not a straight line, your impact isn't over to the river straight from your house. Maybe it's downstream 5 or 6 miles, but it's connected in some way and it's part of the system. So when you turn on your tap, it's coming from groundwater, it's coming from an aquifer, and it's connected to the river, unless you happen to live in Jerome, and then you have a whole different system of springs, and also connected to the river. And so, that's where when we talk about groundwater, this isn't something we can just say, let's just stop doing that. It's really important to know that groundwater is a great drinking water supply for us. It's clean, reduces treatment costs, it's available. We need to use it. And so how do we use it wisely, and how do we replenish what we're taking, and be thoughtful in that approach? So in no way should we think, let's just stop drinking. And I certainly love drinking water. I like drinking coffee.
I do it every day.
I make it 3 times. So, I think that's what's really important, and we need to be super, clear on it. It's great to have drinking water. It's great to have clean water. And we're so lucky because, the U.S. has an amazing drinking water supply overall. Here in Arizona, we have a great clean drinking water supply. And we need to treasure that and think about, in 50 years, we want to have that. But we also want to be able to go kayaking or buy sweet corn, or, we want to still engage in these activities. So we've got to be thoughtful.
So we're getting towards the end of our time here, but I was wondering, you're not much of the person to brag, but if you could just pick out one project that you've done over the last year to tell us about that you're just particularly proud of, something you've done that you really feel like has helped the river.
I think, there's a lot of great projects, and I think if I had to pick one thing that's really vague and unclear, I would say it's collaboration. And I think I really treasure the opportunity to work in our community and to work with agriculture and municipalities and Yavapai Apache Nation and have conversations about what can we do and help identify funding sources. And, this is an important place. We love it locally. But one of the things that the Conservancy is uniquely positioned to do is to leverage that at a scale to bring in funding to do lots of good projects. And so I think that's probably one of my favorite things. But I think if I had to pick the thing that makes me the happiest, I think, this year was watching the combine harvest grain with Yavapai Apache Nation, and knowing that that's contributing to the agricultural economy in our valley, knowing that that's contributing to the health of Yavapai Apache Nation now and into the future, and knowing that that grain uses significantly less water than alfalfa or corn that would otherwise be grown there. And so just finding those solutions where we didn't have to say, no, you lose and you win. We could say, this is winning for all of us. And so that, I think, has probably been my favorite project this year, is just seeing that opportunity for all those people to engage and have a product at the end.
There is something uniquely wonderful about like physically watching a project come to fruition. And, like,
seeing grain in a combine, you're like, I did this.
Exactly. So last question before I let you go. What does the river look like in 20 years?
I think the river in 20 years is going to look better than it does today if we keep taking action. And I think we've got to keep taking action. And, it's going to be healthy. I hope that we've done a lot with upland health. I hope that we're using our effluent and our stormwater wisely. I hope that our agriculture is existing and using sprinklers. And so I don't want it to look significantly different than it does now. And I think we can do that by being smart and collaborative.
Well, thank you, Kim, for joining us today. This has been a fascinating conversation, and we really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you for joining us on Listening to the Verde. We hope to see you back here next time.
Great. Thanks, Max.
Listening to the Verde is brought to you by Friends of the Verde River. Please visit verderiver.org/listening for more videos and resources.